Good afternoon. So my discussion this week is about Martin Knowles' America's God from Jonathan Edwards to Abraham Lincoln. So just going through a few points of what Knoll discussed in his chapter 5 of this book, which I was a little bit familiar with beforehand, just from having used it as a source in another class or another assignment at one time. So when I saw it on the list, then I thought it just made sense to use it again, or to use, to go back into it. I'm just slightly familiar with it. I haven't used it much, but just a few points. The chapter addresses the merger of Protestant beliefs with republicanism, or the idea of this, these liberty and freedom for the Americans from the British at the time. It helped to develop this unique way of merging the two things together with Republican ideals and Protestant, not Catholic theology in the 13 colonies in the mid 18th century. It helped to influence. It was influenced a lot by the circumstances in America at the time, especially the French and Indian War, and then eventually the American Revolution. Then it also it became a part of American culture. It became very routine by the 19th century. Some of the key figures mentioned in this chapter were Elias Smith, who was a preacher and was a big publicist or proponent for the First Great Awakening. And then also James Smith, who was a Presbyterian minister and a militia captain. It was said that those two kind of epitomized the linking of religious or Protestant theology and Republican principles. Conservative Presbyterian John Breckinridge was also a minister who wrote of the contrast between American freedom and the realities of life in Europe or life in the colonies, the European colonies. Then it talks about the evangelical influence. The middle of the 18th century, you had evangelists like George Whitefield, who began blending political language with his sermons and creating what we would begin to term Republican Christianity. His preaching style emphasized individual choice and a movement away from congregationalism, which was prevalent in New England until this time, to more of sermons that focus more on one's personal relationship with God rather than the church as a whole, or community church, congregational church as a whole. As we moved on, it talked more about religious writing and teaching and sermons coming out of New England. So people like Jonathan Edwards, who's most famous as a figure from the Great Awakening, he began to interject the language of liberty into his sermons. Then there were more liberal figures like Charles Chauncey, who was a Congregationalist minister and a physician, and he merged religious and political categories as well in his teachings. Another one mentioned there in New England was Thomas Prince, who had a famous sermon in 1746 that he preached in Boston, which celebrated religious and political victories together, and was one of the more prominent early sermons that did this. He also talked about the rise of the Whigs, or the teachings, or that we would know as a Whig party eventually. A lot of anti-Catholic sentiment became very prevalent during the time, with a lot of ministers referring to the Pope as being the Antichrist. Then another point about the Whigs, the Whig ideology, was Jonathan Mayhew gave a sermon in 1750 that illustrated the shift towards republicanism by arguing against the divine right of kings and talking about Republican values and liberties. This marked a big shift in Christianity in America in light of our relationship with Great Britain. So again, we're talking about breaking away from the monarchy, breaking away from the divine right of kings, or the divine right to rule just because you are the heir of the previous monarch. And then lastly, the spread of republicanism influence on reforms in the country. Republicanism spread a lot throughout colonial clergymen, intertwined with the traditional Protestant fears of Catholicism. And this began to give kind of a spiritual or religious underpinning or support to the American Revolution, which was to come soon thereafter. Figures like Samuel Davies, the frontier Presbyterian minister, and then Isaac Backus, who was a Baptist minister, pushed for religious freedom, using Republican language and terms in talking about religious reforms. And then lastly, he talked about Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense, which went on to become a bestseller in the colonies in just a short period of time, selling thousands of copies. That kind of set the colonies on fire, and then gave this everyone the same thoughts for the most part regarding breaking away from the British. But Paine used biblical narratives as well in his pamphlet. So that's kind of the summary or summation of America's God, Jonathan Edwards, Abraham Lincoln, Chapter 5 by Mark Knoll. On a side note, I am creating this thread today. You might hear fireworks every once in a while in the background. So I'm doing this on the 4th of July outside in the backyard at the house that we're renting for a vacation for the next couple of weeks in Florida. So just thought I'd do it a little differently today, try to mix things up with locations and whatnot. But anyway, I think that the fireworks in the background are a nice touch, considering it's the 4th of July, it's Independence Day, and we're studying the American Revolution this term. Thank you.